Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we dim the lights and slide into a story that will likely break your heart before you get a chance to fall asleep. Tonight we're peeling back the curtain on a woman who was branded the ugliest woman in the world, a title she never asked for but was forced to wear her entire life. A life that was one long, excruciating performance. Imagine the soft rustle of a heavy velvet curtain, a single spotlight piercing the darkness, and you standing on a stage feeling the breathless hush of 1,000 staring eyes. You feel the heat of the gas lamps, the subtle scent of sawdust and cheap perfume, and you know, with a chilling certainty, that this is the moment you must become a spectacle. You'll be presented as a creature of wonder and horror, not because of what you've done, but simply because of who you are. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment with your location and local time so we can all feel a little less alone in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins far from the clamour of a European stage or the brightly lit streets of New York. It starts in the quiet, rolling hills of rural Mexico, a place where time moves at a different pace, and the world beyond the mountains is little more than a whisper. The year is 1834, and a child is born in the state of Sinaloa, in a village so remote it barely registers on a map. This child, named Julia Pastrana, arrives in a world that is not ready for her. Even at birth she is different. Covered in a thick coat of dark hair, with a jaw and facial features that are profoundly pronounced, she is immediately set apart. Her body, however, is a fascinating paradox. While her face and arms are covered in this dense, dark fleece, a condition modern science would later identify as hypertrichosis terminalis, sometimes called werewolf syndrome. Her legs and torso are mostly unaffected. It's a striking, almost mythological contradiction that makes her both an object of fascination and fear from her very first breath. You can almost feel the tension in the small adobe home, the gasps of the midwives, the hushed whispers of the family. A mainstream historical fact from this period is that, in many rural communities, a child born with such an obvious physical difference would often be considered a bad omen or a sign of divine punishment. This was an age before genetic understanding, where folklore and superstition often filled the gaps in knowledge. For a family in this isolated, deeply religious part of Mexico, Julia's birth must have felt like a profound challenge to their faith and their place in the community. You can picture her mother, a woman who had likely endured the hardships of a life tied to the land, trying to shield her newborn from the frightened eyes of others, her maternal love battling with a deep, unsettling sense of dread. As a baby, she was a curiosity, a secret kept within the family's modest home. But as she grew, her appearance became impossible to hide. Her face, framed by the thick dark hair that grew down her cheeks and forehead, seemed to belong to another world. Her jaw was robust and her teeth were unusually large, earning her the nickname the Ape Woman, or the Bear Woman, among the cruelest of her peers. Yet beneath this startling exterior was a bright, curious mind. She was, by all accounts, an intelligent and sensitive child who, despite her isolation, learned to read and write. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. Even though she was often ostracized, she was a gifted singer and dancer. She had a beautiful, clear voice that defied the ruggedness of her appearance, and she moved with a natural grace that was completely unexpected. It's a detail that adds another layer to her complexity. The woman behind the spectacle was a person of immense talent and humanity. Historians still argue whether her family truly abandoned her, or if she was given away to a life she was destined for. The accepted version of the story is that when Julia was in her late teens, a man named Pedro Sanchez, who was the governor of Sinaloa, took her from her family and brought her into his household as a kind of ward. Some accounts say he was acting as a kind of benefactor, offering her a chance at a better life away from the taunts and whispers of her village. Others suggest he was already seeing her as a valuable possession, a curiosity he could show off to his guests. The reality, as is often the case, is probably a muddled, complex mixture of both. You can imagine her walking down from the mountains, leaving behind the only world she had ever known, perhaps with a flicker of hope in her heart. She was a woman without a past, now stepping into an uncertain future. Life with the governor was, for a time, a strange kind of sanctuary. She was educated and treated with a degree of respect she had never known. But you can never escape what others see when they look at you. Even in this new home, she was a living, breathing spectacle. Guests would be brought in to see her, to marvel at her uniqueness. She was the governor's prized possession, a human artifact of sorts. This period of her life is a crucial turning point, because it's where she becomes fully aware of her value not as a person, but as a performance. The gentle curiosity of the governor and his guests was a prelude to the relentless, dehumanizing gaze of the world that awaited her. It was the first step on a long, tragic road from a secluded Mexican village to the brightly lit stages of the world's most famous theatres. She was learning, in the most painful way possible, that her existence was no longer her own. It belonged to the eyes that watched her. As her time with the governor continued, the whispers of her strange beauty began to travel beyond the mountains, reaching the ears of men who saw not a person, but profit. The 19th century was the golden age of the freak show, and men like P.T. Barnum were making fortunes by presenting human oddities to a public hungry for the bizarre and the sensational. Julia was, in their eyes, a gold mine. She had the perfect combination of rarity and visual spectacle. She was not just a curiosity, she was a medical marvel, a biological enigma. Her story, her very existence, was a commodity waiting to be exploited. And so, a new chapter was about to begin, one that would see her traded from one showman to another, each one promising her a new life, a new beginning, while only ever seeing her as a means to an end. You can almost feel the shift in the air, the turning of a key, as the quiet life she had known, however strange and isolated, was about to be locked away forever. She was about to become Julia Pastrana, the world's most famous and most heartbreaking spectacle. You're a child, and the world is a kaleidoscope of textures and sounds, but your world is different. It's quiet, marked by the soft rustle of dry leaves and the hushed tones of adults. You're a secret, a curiosity, a living enigma kept behind closed doors. We left you as Julia, a young girl in the remote Mexican mountains living a life of isolation. The air around you is thick with the unspoken, with a sense of being both a precious burden and a strange fascination. You're not playing with the other children, not running through the fields because their eyes, the unblinking, curious, and sometimes cruel eyes, are too much to bear. This is a childhood defined not by innocence and play, but by profound loneliness. Her early years were a study in contradiction. While she was sequestered, Julia was not entirely neglected. The governor, Pedro Sanchez, had taken her in, and under his care she received an education far beyond what she would have ever received in her rural village. She learned to read and write, and it's said she could converse in 3 languages: Spanish, English, and French. This is a mainstream historical fact that adds a crucial layer to her story. She was not the unthinking, primal creature some later showman would claim her to be. She was an intelligent, articulate woman trapped inside a body that the world saw as monstrous. She was a mind of immense clarity encased in a physical form that caused a stir everywhere she went. It's an important detail because it completely shatters the stereotype that would be built around her for the rest of her life. She was a scholar, a linguist, a person of depth and feeling, and the world only ever saw the surface. Think for a moment about the cognitive dissonance this must have caused her. You're a person who can read poetry, who can understand the nuances of different cultures, and yet, when you look in a mirror, you see the reflection that the world sees. You see the dense, dark hair covering your face, the pronounced jaw, the unusual features. You know that no matter what thoughts are inside your head, no matter how eloquently you can express them in multiple languages, the first and only thing people will ever notice is your appearance. This is a kind of psychological torture, a constant battle between your inner self and your outer shell. Historians still argue whether this education was a blessing or a curse. Was Sanchez a kind man who genuinely wanted to give her a better life? Or was he a shrewd entrepreneur, polishing his products to make her more valuable to future buyers? You can almost hear the soft, speculative hum of academic debate in the background as you consider this question. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Julia's favourite pastime was to sing. Her voice, a clear and melodic soprano, was a stunning counterpoint to her appearance. She would often sing alone in her room, a beautiful haunting sound echoing through the quiet halls of the governor's home. It's a detail that humanises her, that reminds us she was a person of immense talent, and not just a scientific curiosity. Imagine her, a young girl alone with her thoughts and her music, finding a brief and fleeting escape from the relentless scrutiny of the world. Her voice was her one form of rebellion, a way to express her inner beauty in a way that her physical form never could. This is the woman who would be paraded on stages across the world, a woman who had a hidden life of music and thought that the public never knew, or cared, to see. Her time in the governor's household was a gilded cage. It was a step up from the impoverished village life, a temporary reprieve from the brutal taunts of children, but it was still a form of captivity. She was a ward, a pet, a conversation piece. She was a display item. You get the sense that she was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when her life of relative comfort would come crashing down. And it did. The whispers that began in Sinaloa eventually reached the ears of showmen in the United States. These men, a motley crew of snake oil salesmen and ambitious entrepreneurs, were always on the hunt for the next big thing, the next human curiosity that could fill their tents and theatres with paying customers. They saw Julia not as a person, but as a financial opportunity, a living, breathing spectacle waiting to be put on display. The moment of transition must have been both terrifying and exhilarating for her. She was leaving the only life she had known, a life that was deeply lonely but at least predictable. She was entering a world she knew nothing about, a world of bright lights and bustling cities and endless crowds. You can almost feel the nervous energy, the mix of fear and hope as she boarded a ship or a carriage, leaving the quiet mountains behind. This is the moment she crosses the threshold from private curiosity to public spectacle. From this point on, her life is no longer her own. It belongs to the promoters, the audiences, and the cold, unblinking gaze of science. The men who would soon take charge of her life were not monsters in the classical sense, but they were products of a profoundly exploitative age. The mid-19th century was a time when the lines between medicine and entertainment were blurry, and a person's physical difference was often seen as both a medical marvel and a source of entertainment. Julia, with her dense hair and unusual facial features, was the perfect subject for this unholy marriage of science and showmanship. Her condition, hypertrichosis, was so rare that it fascinated doctors and the public alike. They saw her as a link between humanity and the animal kingdom, a physical manifestation of the theories of evolution that were just beginning to percolate in the scientific community. You can feel the weight of this on her shoulders. She was no longer just a person, she was a living, breathing hypothesis. It's easy to look back with modern sensibilities and condemn everyone involved, but the reality is more complex. In this period, for someone like Julia, a life in a freak show was often the only way to achieve a measure of financial independence and stability. It was a life of exploitation, to be sure, but it was also a life of travel, of learning, and of a kind of fame. It was a life that, on some level, offered a choice, however grim that choice might seem to us now. The alternative was often a life of poverty, ostracism and destitution. For Julia, leaving the governor's home and entering the world of the circus was a leap of faith, a desperate gamble for a better life. She traded the quiet suffering of isolation for the public agony of being a spectacle. And so, we leave her as she begins her journey. She's a woman of immense intelligence and talent, with a voice that can move mountains. But she's about to be branded the ugliest woman in the world. She's leaving behind the only place that has ever been her home, the mountains of Mexico, and is heading toward a future filled with bright lights, endless crowds, and a form of exploitation that would follow her long after her death. The private life of Julia Pastrana is over. The public tragedy of Julia Pastrana is just beginning. You can almost feel the rumble of the train, the sway of the ship carrying her farther and farther away from the quiet solitude of her childhood and into the deafening noise of her destiny. The journey from the rugged Sierra Madre Mountains to the bustling world of American show business was not a simple one. We left Julia on the precipice of a new life, a life of profound uncertainty and relentless public gaze. Her quiet, isolated existence in the governor's home was now a distant memory, replaced by the jarring reality of travel. You can picture her, perhaps in a covered wagon or on a dusty train, the landscape changing from the familiar arid hills to the sprawling cultivated fields of a foreign land. She's no longer just Julia, the girl from Sinaloa. She's a product, a commodity, being transported to market. The world she is entering is one of spectacle and exploitation, a place where her very existence is the main attraction. This transition from a quiet life to a life on the road was the crucial first step in her dehumanization. She was traded, almost like a piece of livestock, from one ambitious man to another. The first to truly see her commercial value was a man named Francisco Sepulveda, a travelling salesman and showman. He was the one who arranged her passage out of Mexico, promising her family, or perhaps just her guardian, a sum of money and the promise of a better life for their daughter. Historians still argue about the precise details of this transaction. Was it a sale, a legal guardianship, or a simple business arrangement? The documents are vague, lost to time, but the outcome is clear. Julia was now under the control of a man who saw her as a living, breathing ticket to fortune. This is a point of debate that reminds us how slippery the truth can be when it comes to the lives of the marginalized. Sepulveda brought her to the United States and began to show her to a curious public. This was the mid-19th century, a time when P.T. Barnum was building his empire on the backs of what he called human curiosities. The public was hungry for the strange, the exotic, and the sensational. It was an age of phrenology and pseudoscience, where people genuinely believed they could understand a person's character by the shape of their skull, and where a person's physical difference was often interpreted as a sign of their moral or intellectual standing. Julia, with her dense hair and distinct facial features, was the perfect subject for this kind of thinking. She was a biological marvel, a living testament to the wonders of nature, or so the posters would claim. You can almost see the first advertisements, crude woodcuts showing a figure that was part woman, part bear. The language was sensational, designed to entice and shock. The bear woman, the ape lady, the ugliest woman in the world, these were the names she was given, the labels that would follow her for the rest of her short, tragic life. The showmen didn't care about her intelligence, her musical talent, or her gentle nature. They only cared about the public's reaction, the gasps of horror and the morbid fascination that would fill their coffers. This is a mainstream historical fact. The 19th century public's appetite for freak shows was insatiable, and these shows were often a person's only path to a life beyond destitution. Julia's first performances were likely small, in dusty tents or makeshift theatres. She would be put on a platform, and the showman would deliver a bombastic monologue, detailing her strange origins and her peculiar biology. Then, the curtain would be pulled back and the crowd would see her. You can imagine the feeling of that moment. The blinding lights, the sea of faces, all of them staring, judging and whispering. You're not a person to them. You're a thing, an object of study, a source of entertainment. A quirky tidbit from this time is that she was taught to perform a simple, almost comical dance and to sing a few popular songs. The showman wanted to emphasize the contrast between her primal appearance and her civilized talents. They wanted to show that even a creature like her could be tamed and taught, a narrative that played directly into the racial and social prejudices of the time. Her time with Sepulveda was a brief but significant prelude to the rest of her life. It was during this period that she was first seen by a man who would become the most significant and destructive figure in her story, a man named Theodore Lent. Lent was a small-time impresario, a man with big ambitions but little capital. He saw Julia not just as a profitable act, but as an entire career. He saw her and saw dollar signs, a way out of his own poverty and into the world of high society and wealth. He was not a showman in the same vein as Barnum, but he was a cunning and manipulative man who understood the mechanics of exploitation better than anyone else. Lent saw the raw potential in Julia, and he saw that Sepulveda was not maximizing her value. He likely saw that she could be presented not just as a sideshow attraction, but as a genuine scientific curiosity, a subject for the intellectual elite as well as the working-class crowds. He began to court her, not in a romantic sense at first, but with promises of a grander life, of European tours, and of a more dignified existence. He promised her that she would be seen as a person, not a monster, and that her intelligence and talents would be celebrated. You can imagine the hope that this must have sparked in her. After a life of isolation and then brutal public display, the promise of dignity and respect must have been irresistible. The final betrayal of this phase of her life came when Lent managed to wrestle control of her from Sepulveda. He did this through a series of legal maneuvers and probably a fair amount of outright deception. He convinced Julia that he was her best chance at a better life, and he convinced Sepulveda that he could get a bigger return by partnering with him. The details are murky, but the result is clear. Julia Pastrana was now Theodore Lent's possession. He was not just her manager, he was her owner, in every sense of the word. He held her contract, he controlled her finances, and he held the key to her future. And so, we leave Julia at the end of this transitional period, no longer in Mexico and no longer under the care of a minor league showman. She's now under the command of a man who will become her husband and her greatest tormentor. She's standing at the precipice of a new and even more painful chapter of her life. The circus is about to come to town, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the most literal and brutal way imaginable. She's about to become a star, a spectacle, a legend, and the ultimate victim of a man who saw a person and only ever thought of profit. The world, for you, is about to get a lot brighter and a lot more crowded. We left Julia on the cusp of a major shift, having been taken under the wing of Theodore Lent, a man who saw her not as a person, but as a profitable venture. The quiet solitude of her past is gone, replaced by the cacophony of the circus. You can almost smell it now, the sweet sickly scent of spun sugar, the pungent odour of animal dung, and the humid, breathless air of a canvas tent packed with people. This is the new reality. The circus has come to town, and you are the main attraction. This was the golden age of the American sideshow, a mainstream historical fact that shaped the lives of countless individuals with physical differences. People like P.T. Barnum had popularised the notion of human curiosities, turning unusual appearances into a form of mass entertainment. It was a time when a trip to the circus was not just a night out, it was a chance to see things you would never see anywhere else, a chance to be amazed, horrified, and reassured that you were in fact normal. For Julia, this meant she was no longer a secret curiosity. She was a public spectacle, a living, breathing advertisement for the show. The posters for her act were sensational, and by modern standards profoundly cruel. The bearded and hairy lady, the ape woman, the link between man and the orangutan. The language was designed to shock and to draw on the era's fascination with evolution and the exotic. You can feel the weight of these labels, the way they strip away your humanity, reducing you to a caricature. Theodore Lent, her new manager and future husband, was a master of this kind of promotion. He understood that the more outrageous the claim, the more people would pay to see if it was true. Her routine was a carefully constructed performance. She would be presented on a stage, often alone, under the glare of gas lamps. A showman, likely Lent himself, would introduce her with a long, dramatic monologue. He would tell a fantastical tale of her origins, painting a picture of her as a wild creature discovered in the remote mountains of Mexico, perhaps even hinting at a supernatural or animalistic lineage. This was a direct assault on her humanity, a complete fabrication designed to make her seem less like a woman and more like a mythical beast. A quirky or fringe tidbit from her career is that she was an exceptionally gifted dancer. Despite the claims of her being a slow, brutish creature, she moved with surprising grace and agility. She was often made to dance on stage, a performance that was meant to highlight the bizarre contrast between her primal appearance and her civilized movements. It was a performance that was meant to simultaneously titillate and repulse the audience, to show them a woman who was both a beast and a beauty, a truly unsettling paradox. Her life on the road was a constant cycle of travel and performance. The days were long and the accommodations were often Spartan. She would travel from town to town, performing for a few days before moving on to the next. The constant motion, the endless new faces, the relentless scrutiny. It must have been an exhausting and isolating existence. Historians still argue whether she found any genuine solace or companionship during this time. Did she form bonds with the other performers, the other freaks who were also living a life of public display? Or was she kept separate, a prized possession to be guarded and isolated? We can only speculate, but given Lent's possessive and controlling nature, it's likely she was kept on a short leash. Her performances were not just entertainment, they were also a form of scientific inquiry. The mid-19th century was a time of immense scientific curiosity, and doctors and scholars would often attend these shows, not just for entertainment, but to study her. They would often ask to examine her, to measure her, to write papers about her condition. She was a living case study, a tangible example of human variation. This is a cruel reality of her life. She was constantly being evaluated, prodded and measured, her body treated as a subject of intellectual debate rather than as a human being. The psychological toll of this must have been immense. Imagine waking up every day knowing that you are the object of 1,000 stares, 100 whispers, a dozen medical treatises. You're not a person with hopes and dreams. You're a curiosity, a problem to be solved, a link in the great chain of being. Julia, a woman of deep intelligence and sensitivity, was forced to live a life that denied her very humanity. She was a woman who spoke multiple languages and sang like an angel, but she was presented to the world as a hairy ape woman. The dissonance between her inner life and her public persona must have been a constant, painful burden. The show, however, was a success. Crowds flocked to see her, and Lent was making a small fortune. He was a shrewd businessman, and he knew how to capitalize on her unique appearance. He knew how to build the myth around her, to make her seem even more exotic and strange than she already was. He was the impresario, the ringmaster, the man who held the strings, and Julia was his puppet, his prize, his ticket to the good life. This section of her life, her time in the American sideshow, is a dark chapter in the history of entertainment. It's a reminder that the line between fascination and exploitation is a thin one, and that for many people, that line was crossed every single day. Julia was not an exception. She was a prime example of a system that profited from human difference, a system that treated people as objects, and a system that stripped them of their dignity in the name of entertainment. And so, we leave her here, on the stage, under the hot lights, her face framed by hair, her body in motion. The crowd is roaring, a mix of awe and disgust. She's singing a song, a beautiful, haunting melody that the audience barely hears over their own whispers. She is Julia Pastrana, the ugliest woman in the world, and she is at the height of her American fame. But a new chapter is about to begin, one that will see her move beyond the sideshow tents and into the grand theatres of Europe, a move that will promise a different kind of life, but will ultimately lead to the same tragic end. The promise of a better life, a more dignified existence, can be a powerful and dangerous thing. We left Julia at the height of her American fame, a sideshow star performing for packed tents and hungry crowds. But the man who held her future in his hands, Theodore Lent, was not satisfied with the modest profits of the provincial circuit. He saw a bigger stage, a grander audience, and a more sophisticated way to exploit her uniqueness. He saw a way to move beyond the crude posters and sawdust floors of the American circus and into the gilded theatres of Europe. And so, a new contract was drafted, one that would cement her fate and his fortune. You can almost feel the air in the room as this new arrangement is being discussed. Lent, with his smooth talk and his grandiose promises, would have been a master manipulator. He likely promised Julia a life of refinement, a chance to be seen not just as a spectacle, but as a genuine performer, a person of talent. He would have played on her deepest desires, her longing for acceptance and her wish to be seen as more than her appearance. This is a crucial moment in her story, the moment she willingly enters into a contract that will ultimately seal her doom. Historians still argue whether she was a willing participant in this arrangement or a victim of coercion. The truth is likely a muddled, heartbreaking mix of both. She was an intelligent woman, but she was also a woman with very few options, and Lent was a man who knew exactly how to make himself seem like the only one. This new contract was more than just a business agreement. It was a marriage proposal. Lent, in a move that was both bizarre and profoundly calculated, offered to marry her. On the surface, it seemed like an act of genuine affection, a sign that he saw her as a person worthy of love and commitment. But underneath, it was a cold, hard business decision. Marrying her would give him complete legal control over her and her earnings, solidifying his ownership in a way that no contract ever could. In the 19th century, a woman's legal identity was often subsumed into her husband's, and for a woman like Julia, who was already on the fringes of society, this would have made her his property in every sense of the word. A mainstream historical fact is that this kind of legal and financial arrangement was not uncommon in the world of show business. Managers often married their performers to secure their assets and ensure their loyalty. But with Julia and Lent, it was particularly grotesque. He was not marrying her for love, he was marrying her for control. He was tying his fate to hers, not because he cared for her, but because she was a walking, talking gold mine. You can almost see the wedding itself. It would have been a strange, quiet affair, devoid of the usual pomp and circumstance. Lent, a man who would later have mistresses and other lovers, was making a deal, not a vow. Julia, on the other hand, might have seen it as a moment of genuine hope, a moment when someone for the first time in her life was choosing her, flaws and all. This is the tragic beauty of her story. Her capacity for hope, her desire for a normal life, was constantly being exploited by the men who controlled her. With the new contract and the new marriage, Lent began to rebrand her. He was no longer presenting her as a crude sideshow attraction. He was now presenting her as the hybrid, a scientific marvel, a subject for the intellectual elite. He began to book her in prestigious theatres and concert halls, not just in circus tents. The show was more refined, more scientific. He would often present her alongside a doctor or a naturalist who would lecture on her condition, using pseudo-scientific language to make her seem more legitimate and less like a carnival act. This is a quirky tidbit from her career. She was often the subject of these lectures, sitting on stage while a man in a white coat debated her origins, her intelligence, and her place on the evolutionary ladder. This shift in presentation allowed Lent to charge higher ticket prices and attract a more affluent audience. Julia was no longer just a spectacle for the working class. She was a conversation piece for high society. She was a woman who could be seen at a fancy dinner party one night, and on a stage being dissected by a doctor the next. The exploitation was no longer just physical, it was intellectual and psychological. She was being used to sell tickets, to sell newspapers, and to sell a version of herself that was a complete and utter lie. The early days of her marriage to Lent were likely a mix of public performance and private misery. He would have been charming and attentive when it served his purposes, but he was also a possessive and controlling man. He controlled every aspect of her life, from her wardrobe to her public appearances. He was her manager, her husband, her publicist, and her captor all rolled into one. You can feel the suffocating weight of his control, the way it would have slowly chipped away at her sense of self, her sense of agency. She was no longer a person, she was a product, and he was her sole proprietor. The marriage, while a cynical business arrangement, also gave her a kind of strange legitimacy. People were fascinated by the fact that this ape woman had married a normal man. It added another layer of intrigue to her story, another reason for people to come and see her. It was a narrative that Lent was only too happy to exploit. He would often speak about his love for her in public, painting a picture of a devoted husband who saw past her appearance to the beautiful woman within. It was a lie, of course, but it was a very profitable one. And so, we leave Julia in this strange gilded cage of a marriage. She is now legally tied to the man who controls her life and her finances. She's no longer just a sideshow act. She's a scientific marvel, a public curiosity for the intellectual elite. The American tour is over, and a new, more refined and more brutal chapter is about to begin. They are on their way to Europe, a continent where her fame will reach a new peak, and where her exploitation will become even more refined and more profound. The contract is signed, the vows are exchanged, and the stage is set for the final tragic act of her life. You are a woman of immense intelligence and talent, with a voice that can move mountains, and yet you stand on a stage, your face framed by hair, and you are called the Hairy Lady. We left Julia in a new, profoundly complex phase of her life, legally bound to the man who was both her husband and her captor, Theodore Lent. The American sideshows were now a thing of the past, replaced by the grand theatres and lecture halls of the burgeoning European circuit. The air around you is no longer filled with the smells of sawdust and cheap popcorn, but with the scent of gas lamps, velvet curtains, and the lingering perfume of a curious and often cruel audience. The posters for her shows in Europe were no less sensational than in America, but they were a bit more refined. Instead of focusing solely on her beast-like qualities, Lent began to emphasise the scientific angle. The advertisements now touted her as the hybrid, a link between man and the orangutan, and a subject of intense academic debate. This was a shrewd business move on Lent's part. He was no longer just selling a spectacle. He was selling an educational experience, a chance for people to see a living, breathing scientific marvel. This is a mainstream historical fact. The 19th century public's fascination with Darwin's theories of evolution made people like Julia the subject of intense interest, both from a scientific and a sensationalist perspective. Her life on the road was a constant performance, a grueling cycle of travel, setup and showtime. You can imagine the psychological toll it took on her. Waking up every day to the knowledge that your entire existence is a spectacle, that every glance, every whisper is a judgment on your appearance. She was an object of study, a conversation piece, a source of income, but she was rarely, if ever, seen as a person. Lent, her husband and manager, was always there, a constant reminder of her status as a possession. He controlled her money, her schedule, and her public image. Her marriage was a gilded cage, offering a semblance of security while stripping her of her autonomy. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Julia had an immense love for fashion. Despite the often crude and sensational nature of her performances, she would insist on being dressed in the finest clothes. She would wear expensive gowns, jewellery, and intricate hairstyles, a conscious effort to present herself as a woman of refinement and taste, a direct contradiction to the image her husband was selling. It was a small act of rebellion, a way for her to assert her own identity in a world that was constantly trying to erase it. It was her way of saying, "I am not what you see me as. I am a person of elegance and grace, and you will see it in my clothes, if not in my face." The European tour was an incredible success. She performed in major cities like London, Paris and Berlin, drawing huge crowds and generating immense profits for Lent. Her fame grew with every performance, and she became a household name. You can picture her on stage, a beautiful woman in a beautiful dress, with a face that the world had deemed monstrous. She would sing, she would dance, she would answer questions from the audience, often with a wit and intelligence that would surprise and even disarm her critics. She was a living paradox, a woman who defied every stereotype that was built around her. Historians still argue whether her time in Europe was better or worse for her than her time in America. On one hand, she was now performing in more respectable venues and being presented in a slightly more dignified manner. She was a celebrity, not just a sideshow act. On the other hand, the exploitation was more profound, more intellectual. She was no longer just a curiosity. She was a subject of scientific debate, a human being used to advance a theory that denied her humanity. The gaze of the European elite was just as cruel as the gaze of the American working class, perhaps even more so because it was cloaked in the language of science and progress. Lent, ever the opportunist, used her fame to ingratiate himself with high society. He would throw parties, attend exclusive events, and rub shoulders with the rich and powerful, all on the back of his wife's fame. He was a social climber, a man who had gone from a small-time impresario to a wealthy European gentleman, and he owed it all to her. He was a constant presence in her life, a shadow that followed her wherever she went, a living reminder that her success was not her own, but his. The tours were long and arduous, and the constant travel and performance took a toll on her. She was often exhausted, and the relentless scrutiny must have been emotionally draining. Despite her public persona, she was a deeply private person, and the constant exposure must have been a form of psychological torture. She was a woman who longed for a quiet life, for a home, for a family. But her life was a constant spectacle, a public tragedy playing out on the grandest stages of the world. Her performances were often followed by a medical examination. Doctors and professors would flock to see her, to measure her skull, to examine her teeth, to write papers about her. They would often try to prove that she was not fully human, that she was a missing link, a throwback to a more primitive age. It was a dehumanizing process, one that she had to endure on a regular basis. You can feel the coldness of their instruments, the clinical detachment of their eyes, the way they treated her not as a patient but as a specimen. And so, we leave Julia in this strange, surreal world of European fame. She's a celebrity, a scientific marvel, a woman of great intelligence and talent. But she's also a prisoner, a victim of a cruel and exploitative system, and a woman whose life is no longer her own. She's standing on the world stage under the brightest lights, but she's utterly alone. The next chapter will see her finally try to find a moment of normalcy in the chaos of her life, a brief reprieve from the relentless scrutiny, but as with everything in her life, it will be fleeting and ultimately tinged with tragedy. The world, for you, is a whirlwind of travel and performance, a dizzying cycle of new cities and different faces. We left Julia at the height of her European fame, a celebrity and a scientific marvel, but also a prisoner in a life of relentless public scrutiny. The journey takes her to London, then Paris, then Berlin. but the one constant is the presence of Theodore Lent, her husband and manager, the man who controls every aspect of her existence. You're a star, but you're not free. It was during this period that the relentless scrutiny of both science and society truly intensified. Lent was not just content with her being a sideshow attraction. He wanted her to be a legitimate topic of academic debate, a subject for the intellectual elite. He would often arrange for her to be examined by prominent doctors and scientists of the day. They would come to the theatres, to their hotel rooms, to see her up close. You can almost feel the coldness of their professional gaze, the way they would peer at her, measure her skull and take notes, treating her as a specimen rather than a human being. This is a mainstream historical fact. The 19th century was the golden age of phrenology and nascent evolutionary theory, and scientists were obsessed with finding a physical link between humanity and the animal kingdom. Julia, with her hypertrichosis and her unique facial structure, was the perfect subject for their theories. They saw her as a living embodiment of their hypotheses, a missing link in the evolutionary chain. They would write papers about her, dissecting her physical characteristics in a clinical and often dehumanizing manner. They were not interested in her intelligence, her singing voice, or her gentle nature. They were interested in her teeth, her jaw, the density of her hair. They were reducing her to a series of measurements and observations, erasing her humanity in the name of science. The public's fascination was a strange mix of morbid curiosity and genuine intellectual interest. People would flock to her shows, not just to see a spectacle, but to see a woman who was the subject of so much debate. The newspapers would run articles about her, often with headlines that were sensational and cruel, but also with quotes from doctors and professors that gave the whole enterprise a veneer of respectability. Lent, ever the master of promotion, knew exactly how to play both sides. He would advertise her as the hairy lady for the general public and as the hybrid for the scientific community. He was a master of marketing, and his product was his wife. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that one prominent Russian doctor, P.A.S. Sannikov, wrote a paper on her that, while still highly clinical, actually paid some mind to her human qualities. He noted her intelligence, her pleasant demeanour, and her musical talents, and he concluded that despite her appearance, she was a person of great human worth. This was a rare moment of empathy in a sea of dehumanization. It's a small detail, but it's a powerful one, a brief flicker of recognition that she was not just a specimen, but a person with a mind and a soul. The psychological toll of this constant scrutiny must have been immense. Imagine being on display, day in and day out, not just for entertainment, but as a living hypothesis. Imagine having your body dissected in public, your very humanity debated in a scientific journal. Julia, a woman who longed for acceptance and normalcy, was forced to live a life that was the exact opposite. She was constantly being reminded that she was different, that she was not a part of the world she was so desperately trying to fit into. Her life was a performance, and the stage was the entire world. Historians still argue whether Julia genuinely believed she was helping to advance science, or if she was a reluctant participant in this process. It's likely that she was a bit of both. On one hand, she was a woman of her time, and the idea of being a subject of scientific inquiry might have carried a certain prestige. On the other hand, she was a woman who was being exploited for profit, and the constant physical and emotional strain of her life must have been a constant reminder of that. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a tragic mix of hope and exploitation, of a woman trying to make the best of a terrible situation. Lent's control over her was absolute. He controlled her money, her schedule, and her social life. He was a constant presence, a reminder that her freedom was an illusion. He would often tell her that he was protecting her from a cruel world, that he was the only one who truly cared for her. It was a classic form of manipulation, a way to make her dependent on him, and to keep her from ever leaving. The marriage, which on the surface seemed to offer her a measure of security, was in fact a cage, a legal and emotional trap from which she could never escape. The constant travel, the endless performances, the dehumanizing scientific scrutiny, it all began to take a toll on her health. She was often tired, her body worn down by the rigours of the road, but Lent, ever the showman, would not let her rest. He had a schedule to keep, and he had a fortune to make. He was pushing her to her physical and emotional limits, all in the name of profit. The world was her stage, and she was on it day and night, a living, breathing spectacle for all to see. And so, we leave Julia in this period of intense scrutiny and constant performance. She is a woman who is both a celebrity and a prisoner, a scientific marvel and a human being, a wife and a possession. She is a living paradox, a woman who defies every label that has been placed on her, and yet she is trapped by them all. The next chapter of her life will see a brief moment of quiet and a glimmer of hope, a chance to escape the circus for a brief moment and try to find a semblance of normalcy. But as with everything in her life, it will be a fleeting moment, a brief reprieve before the final tragic act. The relentless pace of a life on the road is a heavy burden, a constant state of motion that leaves no room for roots or rest. We left Julia under the intense scrutiny of European society and science, a woman who was both a celebrity and a prisoner. But even in this whirlwind of exploitation, there were brief, fleeting moments where she and Theodore Lent would settle in a city for an extended period, a chance to perform in one place and for a short while live a semblance of a normal life. One such period was in New York, a city that was a bustling hub of commerce and culture, a place where, for a time, Julia tried to find a place for herself outside of the circus tent. You can picture them in a modest but respectable apartment, a stark contrast to the makeshift dressing rooms and crowded hotels they were accustomed to. The streets of New York, filled with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the chatter of 1,000 different languages, offered a different kind of anonymity. Here, among the endless crowds, Julia was just another face, albeit a profoundly unique one. This was a brief, precious window of time where she was not just a performer, but a person with a routine. She could go for walks, attend social events, and even try to cultivate a life beyond the stage. This is a mainstream historical fact. Despite their constant touring, showmen like Lent would often base themselves in a major city for a season, using the opportunity to ingratiate themselves with local society and drum up business for their shows. Lent, ever the social climber, used these periods to try and establish himself as a man of culture and taste. He would take Julia to the opera, to fancy restaurants, and to social gatherings, all on the back of her fame. He was a master of using her unique appearance to gain access to circles he would otherwise never be a part of. Julia, for her part, was a surprisingly willing participant in these events. She was a highly intelligent and educated woman, and she enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of conversation and the refined atmosphere of high society. You can almost see her in a beautiful dress, her face framed by her dense hair, sitting at a table with men and women who were fascinated by her, but who were, for a change, also interested in what she had to say. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Julia was known for her sense of humour and her wit. Despite the profound tragedy of her life, she had a sharp mind and a quick tongue, and she could often disarm her critics with a clever retort or a well-placed joke. It's said that at one dinner party, a man, staring at her intently, asked, "How is it that you have such a beautiful singing voice but such a strange face?" Julia, without missing a beat, is said to have replied, "Perhaps God was just trying to balance things out." It's a story that, whether true or not, speaks to her resilience and her refusal to be a simple victim. It reminds us that beneath the spectacle, there was a woman of immense spirit and strength. Historians still argue whether Lent's efforts to integrate her into society were a genuine attempt to give her a better life, or just another form of exploitation. It's likely a bit of both. He was a man who craved respectability, and having a wife who was a celebrity, and who could converse with the intellectual elite, was a way for him to achieve it. He was also, at his core, a showman, and he knew that presenting her as a woman of refinement and culture made her even more intriguing to the public. He was selling a paradox, a woman who was both a beast and a beauty, a spectacle and a scholar. It was a marketing strategy, pure and simple, but it was also a strategy that, for a brief time, allowed Julia a small measure of normalcy. These periods of quiet, however, were always temporary. The relentless pressure of the road, the constant need for new audiences, and Lent's insatiable desire for money would always win out. The quiet dinners and the intellectual conversations would eventually be replaced by the roar of the crowd and the glare of the stage lights. The brief moments of quiet in New York were just a temporary reprieve, a chance to catch her breath before the next grueling tour. The psychological impact of this back and forth must have been immense. One moment, you're a person, a woman with a name and a voice, a dinner guest. The next, you're a spectacle, an object of scientific curiosity, an animal in a cage. This constant shift in identity must have been incredibly disorienting, a constant reminder that her place in the world was conditional, based entirely on the whims of her husband and the morbid curiosity of the public. During one of these tours, she was subjected to a particularly cruel and dehumanizing incident. A group of doctors, led by a prominent physician, asked to examine her. They not only measured her skull and body, but they also created a wax model of her head, a permanent record of her unique features. This is an incredible and morbid fact of her story. She was literally turned into an artifact, a physical representation of her own dehumanization. That wax head would go on to be displayed in museums, a testament to the era's fascination with human curiosities and its profound lack of empathy. And so, we leave Julia in this precarious balance between two worlds, the private world of her intelligence and wit, and the public world of her exploitation and fame. She's a woman who has found a brief moment of quiet in the chaos, a chance to be a person, not just a performer. But the road is calling, and the next chapter of her life will take her to a new continent, a new tour, and a new, even more devastating form of betrayal. The brief respite in New York is over, and the stage is set for her final, most tragic act. The quiet streets of New York were a brief, beautiful illusion. We left Julia having tasted a moment of normalcy, a fleeting chance to be seen as a person and not just a product. But the road and her husband's ambition beckoned. The next leg of her journey would take her across the Atlantic to Europe, where her fame would reach a new, astonishing peak. The posters were more elaborate, the theatres grander, and the exploitation in its own way became more refined. You're on a ship now, the rocking of the waves a constant reminder of the vast distance you're putting between yourself and the life you briefly knew. The wind whips at your hair, a sensation that, for a moment, feels like freedom. But you know it's not. The journey across the sea is not a vacation. It's a transfer of goods. You are the cargo, a valuable commodity being shipped to a new market. Theodore Lent, your husband and owner, paces the deck, a manic glint in his eye. He's not thinking of the ocean or the fresh air. He's thinking of the profits, the packed houses, the new fortune that awaits him. Upon their arrival in Europe, they were met with a level of public interest that surpassed anything they had seen in America. Europe, with its long history of art, science, and spectacle, was the perfect stage for Julia. The public was obsessed with the exotic, the strange, and the new. They flocked to see the hybrid, a woman who was a living testament to the wonders of nature, and a subject of intense scientific debate. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era in Europe was captivated by human curiosities, with freak shows and sideshows being a hugely popular form of entertainment. Julia's tour of Europe was not just a series of performances, it was a cultural event, a public spectacle that captured the imagination of an entire continent. Lent was a master of promotion, and he adapted his strategy for the more refined European audiences. He no longer presented Julia as a simple sideshow act. He presented her as a genuine medical and scientific marvel. He would often lecture alongside her, a long-winded pseudo-scientific monologue about her origins and her place on the evolutionary ladder. He would bring out doctors and academics who would confirm his wild claims, giving the entire spectacle a veneer of intellectual respectability. You can picture her on stage, a beautiful woman in an elegant dress, a stark contrast to the scientific jargon being thrown around about her supposed primal nature. She was a living paradox, and that's what made her so fascinating to the public. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is that Julia became a minor celebrity in certain intellectual circles. She was known to be a brilliant conversationalist, a witty and intelligent woman who could hold her own in a debate. She would often be invited to dinners and social gatherings, where she would charm the guests with her intelligence and her beautiful singing voice. It's said that she had a favourite song she would sing, a Spanish folk tune that was both haunting and beautiful. It was in these moments that she was truly herself, a woman of depth and talent, not just a spectacle. But even in these moments, the public's fascination with her appearance was always there, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Her tour took her to some of the most prestigious theatres in Europe. She performed in London's West End, in the grand opera houses of Paris, and in the bustling theatres of Berlin. The crowds were immense, and the money was pouring in. Lent was becoming a wealthy man, and he was not shy about showing it. He would dress in expensive clothes, stay in the finest hotels, and throw lavish parties. He was living a life of luxury, and he owed it all to her. Julia, on the other hand, was still a prisoner. She was dressed in fine clothes, and she stayed in nice hotels, but she had no control over her life or her money. She was a showpiece, a human doll to be paraded around for profit. Historians still argue about the nature of her relationship with Lent during this time. Was she truly in love with him, or was she just a victim of Stockholm Syndrome? A woman who had been so isolated and so controlled that she had come to believe that the man who owned her was her only salvation. The truth is likely more complex. Julia was a woman who longed for acceptance and love, and Lent, with his grand promises and his occasional displays of affection, was the only man who had ever offered it to her. She was in a deeply codependent relationship, a marriage that was a business arrangement disguised as a love story. The strain of the constant touring and the relentless scrutiny began to take a toll on her health. The long hours, the travel, the emotional stress, it all began to wear her down. But Lent, with his insatiable desire for money, would not let her rest. He was pushing her to her physical and emotional limits, always with the promise of more money, more fame, and a better life. It was a vicious cycle of exploitation, one that would eventually lead to her tragic demise. The tour, for all its fame and fortune, was also a deeply isolating experience. She was surrounded by people, but she was utterly alone. The crowds, the doctors, the socialites, they were all interested in her for what she was, not for who she was. She was a woman who spoke 3 languages, a talented singer and dancer, but the world only ever saw the surface. She was a living, breathing spectacle, and her life was a performance that had no end. The European tour, for all its glamour and success, was a continuation of her tragedy, a grand theatrical act that was leading her toward a final, heartbreaking curtain call. The grand theatres of Europe, with their velvet curtains and hushed audiences, were a world away from the dusty sideshow tents of America. We left Julia at the height of her fame, a celebrated curiosity travelling from one capital city to the next. But her life, for all its public spectacle, was becoming increasingly isolated and controlled. The central figure in this tragedy was still Theodore Lent, a man who saw in her not a wife, but a contract. The final and most devastating chapter of their relationship was a marriage of convenience and profound deceit. You can almost feel the cold dread that must have settled in her heart. The wedding, which we touched upon earlier, was not a celebration of love. It was a business transaction. Lent, a man of limited means and vast ambition, had seen in her not just a profitable performer, but a way to legally and completely control her assets. In the 19th century, a woman's legal identity was often subsumed into her husband's, a grim reality that was doubly tragic for a woman like Julia, who had so little power to begin with. Her marriage to Lent was the ultimate act of ownership, a public declaration that she was his property, his possession, to be used and exploited as he saw fit. A mainstream historical fact is that this kind of marital arrangement was not uncommon in the world of entertainment at the time. Managers would often marry their performers to secure their contracts and prevent them from being poached by rivals. But with Julia, the stakes were higher. She was not just a performer, she was a unique biological marvel, a one-of-a-kind asset. By marrying her, Lent was essentially locking in his fortune for life, a cruel and cynical move that he disguised as an act of love. He would often speak about his deep affection for her in interviews, painting himself as a devoted husband who saw past her unusual appearance to the beautiful woman within. It was a masterful performance, a lie so complete that many people believed it. The daily reality of their marriage was a far cry from the romantic narrative Lent peddled. He was a controlling and manipulative man who kept her on a short leash. He controlled her money, her schedule, and her social interactions. He was a constant presence, a shadow that followed her wherever she went, a reminder that her freedom was an illusion. You can almost feel the suffocating weight of his control, the way it would have slowly chipped away at her sense of self, her sense of agency. She was a celebrity, but she was a celebrity with no autonomy, no voice, and no power. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Julia would often write letters to her family in Mexico. These letters, which were likely intercepted and read by Lent, were a rare glimpse into her inner world. She would write about her loneliness, her longing for home, and the strain of her life on the road. She would also write about her hope for a normal life, a life where she could be a wife and a mother, a life away from the stage and the relentless public gaze. These letters, a poignant and heartbreaking testament to her humanity, stand in stark contrast to the public image of the hairy lady, or the hybrid. They show us a woman who was just like anyone else, a woman who wanted love, family, and a home. Historians still argue whether Julia truly loved Lent, or if she was simply a victim of a codependent relationship. The truth is likely more nuanced. She was a woman who had spent her entire life on the fringes of society, and Lent, with his promises of a better life, and his theatrical displays of affection, was the only man who had ever offered her a place in the world. She might have seen in him not just a husband, but a saviour, a man who could protect her from a cruel world. The tragedy is that the very man who promised to save her was the one who was destroying her. Their marriage was a front, a clever marketing strategy that added another layer of intrigue to her story. The public was fascinated by the idea of this unusual woman marrying a normal man, and Lent was all too happy to exploit that fascination. He would often pose with her for photographs, a proud husband with his unique wife, a tableau of domesticity that was a complete and utter lie. The photographs, which have survived to this day, are a chilling reminder of the performance that was their marriage. The physical and emotional toll of her life and her marriage began to show. The constant touring, the relentless performances, the emotional abuse, it all began to wear her down. She was often ill and her health was failing, but Lent, with his insatiable desire for money, would not let her rest. He was pushing her to her physical and emotional limits, always with the promise of more money, more fame, and a better life. It was a vicious cycle of exploitation, one that would eventually lead to the most tragic event of her life, her pregnancy. The marriage, which began as a business arrangement, was now about to enter its final, most devastating phase. The woman who longed for a home and a family was about to get her wish, but it would be in the most public and tragic way imaginable. Her body, which had been a spectacle for her entire life, was now about to become the subject of an even more intense and morbid fascination. The stage was set, not for a performance, but for a birth, and the final, heartbreaking act of her life was about to begin. The world, for you, is about to become even more intrusive. We left Julia in a marriage that was a business arrangement disguised as a love story, a gilded cage built by Theodore Lent. But life, in its strange and often cruel way, was about to complicate everything. Julia became pregnant. Her body, which had been a spectacle for her entire life, was now about to become the subject of an even more intense and morbid fascination. The news of her pregnancy was not met with joy or celebration, but with a renewed wave of public interest and scientific scrutiny. You can almost feel the weight of 1,000 new eyes, not just on her face, but on her burgeoning stomach. The public was obsessed with the idea of a hairy woman having a baby. What would it look like? Would it inherit her unique traits? Was it even possible for her to have a human child? These were the questions that filled the newspapers and the conversations of the day. Lent, ever the showman, saw this as the ultimate marketing opportunity. He began to advertise her pregnancy, not as a private event, but as a public spectacle. The posters for her shows now featured images of a pregnant Julia, her body a testament to the strange and wonderful mysteries of nature. This is a mainstream historical fact. The 19th century public's fascination with genetics and heredity made Julia's pregnancy a topic of intense interest. Doctors, scientists, and the general public were all morbidly curious about the outcome. They saw her as a living experiment, a chance to see if a hybrid could produce a viable offspring. It was a dehumanizing and cruel way to view a woman's pregnancy, a time that should have been private and filled with hope and joy. But for Julia, there was no privacy, no joy. There was only the relentless public gaze and the cold, calculating ambition of her husband. She continued to perform, even as her body became heavier and more strained. Lent would not let her rest. He was pushing her to her physical and emotional limits, knowing that the public's curiosity was at an all-time high. You can almost see her on stage, her beautiful voice singing a song, her pregnant body a canvas for the world's morbid fascination. It was a performance of profound tragedy, a woman forced to endure the most intimate and personal of life's experiences in the most public and exploitative way imaginable. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Julia would often wear loose-fitting dresses and shawls to try and hide her pregnancy from the public. She was a deeply private person, and the public's obsession with her body was a source of immense shame and discomfort for her. But Lent would often force her to wear tighter-fitting clothes to make her pregnancy more visible, to sell more tickets. It was a constant battle between her desire for privacy and her husband's insatiable desire for profit. She was a woman who longed for dignity, but her life was a constant assault on it. Historians still argue whether Julia had any say in the matter of her pregnancy. Was it a consensual act with a man she may or may not have loved, or was it another form of exploitation, a way for Lent to create the ultimate spectacle? The truth, as with so much of her life, is murky and lost to time. But what is clear is that the pregnancy was not a source of joy for her, but a source of immense anxiety and fear. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the birth of her child would be the most public event of her life, and she feared what the world would do to her baby, a child that would be born into a world that had already judged its mother. The constant stress, the grueling travel, the relentless performances, it all began to take a toll on her health. She was often ill, and her body was under immense strain. But Lent, with his eyes on the prize, would not let her rest. He was pushing her to her breaking point, all in the name of profit. He was a man who saw his wife and his unborn child not as people, but as a product, a living, breathing spectacle that would make him rich. The final leg of her tour was in Moscow, a city that was a world away from her home in Mexico. She was exhausted, and her body was failing. But Lent had booked her into a prestigious theatre, and the crowds were immense. She was at the peak of her fame, a pregnant, hairy lady who had captivated an entire continent. But the performance was about to end, and the final, most tragic act of her life was about to begin. Her confinement was not a private affair. Lent, ever the showman, had arranged for doctors to be present, not just to assist with the birth, but to document it. He wanted a scientific record of the event, a way to further legitimize his claims, and to ensure that her legacy and his profit would live on long after she was gone. It was a final, devastating act of betrayal, a woman forced to give birth in a room full of strangers, all of them there to watch, to judge, and to document. And so, we leave Julia in this moment of profound vulnerability and public exposure. She's a woman on the verge of motherhood, but she's utterly alone. The crowds are cheering, the newspapers are writing, and the doctors are waiting. The stage is set, not for a performance, but for a birth, and the final heartbreaking act of her life is about to begin. The pregnancy, which should have been a private and joyous event, was for Julia the ultimate public spectacle. The breathless anticipation of 1,000 eyes, the cold glare of gas lamps, and the quiet clinical readiness of doctors. This was the setting for the birth of Julia Pastrana's son. We left her in Moscow, exhausted and heavy with child, a woman at the absolute peak of her fame and the nadir of her personal life. The theatre, which had been her stage for so long, was now to be the backdrop for a tragedy so profound it would echo through the decades. On March 20th, 1860, Julia gave birth. But the birth was a nightmare. The labour was long and difficult, and the child, a boy, was born with the same condition as his mother. He was covered in fine, dark hair, with the same distinctive facial features. He was a miniature version of the spectacle his mother had been for her entire life. This is a mainstream historical fact, a detail that was meticulously documented by the doctors Lent had brought in. They were not there to help a woman give birth. They were there to witness a scientific event, to record the birth of a hybrid child. You can almost feel the chill in the room, the doctors taking notes, the cold, clinical language they would use to describe the birth, a human event reduced to a scientific observation. The joy of motherhood, a profound and universal human experience, was denied to Julia. Her son was a spectacle from the moment he was born. The doctors were fascinated, not by his beautiful life, but by his strange appearance. The newspapers, which had been covering her pregnancy for months, now had their headline, "The hairy lady gives birth to a hairy child." The public's morbid curiosity had reached its peak. The The tragedy, however, was just beginning. The boy, fragile and unwell from birth, lived for only 35 hours. He was not strong enough to survive, a tiny victim of a world that had already judged him before he had a chance to breathe. The loss of a child is a pain that is universal and devastating. But for Julia, it was a pain that was compounded by the public nature of her life. She was forced to mourn in the spotlight, her grief a public spectacle, another act in her endless tragic performance. Just 5 days later, Julia herself succumbed to the complications of childbirth. The physical and emotional toll of her life had finally caught up with her. The constant touring, the relentless scrutiny, the profound loneliness, and now the grief of losing her child. It was all too much. She died alone in a foreign city, far from the mountains of Mexico she had called home. Her death, like her life, was not a private matter. It was a headline, a final act in a performance that had spanned a continent. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that in her final moments, Julia is said to have whispered, "I die happy because I am loved." Whether this was a genuine expression of her feelings, or a line concocted by Lent to create a more romantic narrative for her death is lost to time, but it's a detail that, in its heartbreaking simplicity, speaks to her profound longing for love and acceptance, a longing that was never truly fulfilled. Historians still argue about the precise cause of her death. Was it a simple case of postpartum hemorrhage, or was it a case of profound neglect? Lent, a man who saw her as a financial asset, had pushed her to her physical limits, forcing her to perform even as her health was failing. It's not a stretch to imagine that he might have neglected her medical care, seeing her as an investment he was trying to squeeze every last drop of profit from. The truth in this case is likely a grim and heartbreaking mix of both. The deaths of Julia and her son should have been the end of their story. A woman and her child finally at peace, their tragic lives over. But Lent, a man who saw profit in everything, was not finished. He was not just a husband or a manager, he was a proprietor, a man who owned her in life and now, he decided, would own her in death. The bodies of Julia and her son were a valuable asset, and he was not about to let them go to waste. The betrayal was about to enter a new, profoundly grotesque phase. Lent, in a move that is almost impossible to comprehend, commissioned a professor of anatomy at the University of Moscow to embalm the bodies of his wife and child. He wanted them preserved, a permanent record of the spectacle they had been in life. He wanted them to continue to make him money, even in death. It was the ultimate act of disrespect, a final, devastating assault on their dignity. And so, we leave Julia and her son here, their brief, tragic lives over, but their exploitation far from finished. The theatre, which had been their stage in life, was now their mausoleum. The world had stared at them in life, and now, in a final horrifying act of morbid fascination, it would continue to stare at them in death. The story of Julia Pastrana is not just the story of a woman, it is the story of a system of exploitation that would not even grant a person the dignity of a peaceful death. The stage is set for the final, most ghoulish act of their story, a story that would not end with their deaths, but would continue for over a century. The final brutal act of Julia Pastrana's story was not written by her, but by the man who owned her in life, and now claimed to own her in death. We left her and her infant son in Moscow, their brief, tragic lives over. But for Theodore Lent, their deaths were not an end. They were a new, grotesque beginning. His final act of betrayal was a plan so cold and so cynical that it is almost impossible to comprehend. He was a man who saw a woman and a child, and he saw not people, but a product that had just entered a new, more lucrative phase. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the cold silence of the Moscow winter, as Lent made his decision. The bodies of his wife and child were a valuable asset, and he was not about to let them be buried and forgotten. He contacted a professor of anatomy at the University of Moscow and commissioned him to embalm the bodies. This is a mainstream historical fact, a detail so shocking that it is often glossed over, but it is central to the tragedy of her story. He wanted them preserved, a permanent record of the spectacle they had been in life. He wanted them to continue to make him money, even in death. He was the ultimate proprietor, a man who believed that a person's value did not end with their last breath. The process of embalming in the 19th century was a gruesome affair. The bodies would have been treated with a variety of chemicals, including arsenic and other toxic substances, to prevent decomposition. You can picture the macabre scene in the professor's laboratory, the bodies of a woman and her child, their humanity stripped away, turned into a medical curiosity, a grotesque and permanent display. Lent was not just preserving their bodies, he was preserving their exploitation. He was ensuring that their tragic story would continue to be told, not as a story of a woman and a child, but as a story of a scientific anomaly, a freak of nature. With the bodies preserved, Lent began his new tour. This time, there was no need for a live performance. The show was the bodies themselves. He would display them in a glass case, a macabre and horrifying spectacle for all to see. The posters for the new show were just as sensational as the old ones, but now they were even more grotesque. They would proclaim the mummified remains of the ugliest woman in the world and her child. The public, with its insatiable appetite for the bizarre, flocked to see them. They came not just to see a curiosity, but to stare at death itself. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Lent would often tell people that Julia, in her final moments, had requested that her body be preserved and displayed. It was a complete and utter lie, of course, a way for him to legitimize his grotesque business venture. He was a master of manipulation, a man who could turn a tragic death into a romantic narrative, all for the sake of profit. He was a man who saw a person and a child, and he saw only dollar signs. Historians still argue whether Lent was a truly evil man or simply a product of a cruel and exploitative age. The truth is likely more complex. He was a man who was obsessed with money and status, and he saw in Julia a way to achieve both. He was a man who was so caught up in his own ambition that he lost all sense of morality and decency. He was a man who, in the end, was a victim of his own greed, a man who was defined by his grotesque and unforgivable actions. The tours of the mummified bodies were a huge success. Lent made a fortune, and he used the money to live a life of luxury and excess. He remarried to a woman named Marie Bartel, who was a performer herself, a woman who looked strikingly similar to Julia, but did not have her condition. In a final, bizarre twist, Lent tried to recreate the show with his new wife, but it was a failure. There was only one Julia, and there was only one spectacle. He was a man who was forever haunted by the ghost of his dead wife, a ghost that he, in his greed, had created. The bodies of Julia and her son in their glass case were a constant presence in his life. They were his source of income, his claim to fame, his lasting legacy. He would often speak about them, about their tragic story, all while pocketing the money from the morbidly curious public. He was a man who had turned his dead wife and child into a business, a man who'd committed the ultimate act of betrayal. The fate of Julia Pastrana and her son, however, was not to be a quiet one. After Lent's death, their bodies would be sold and resold, passed from one showman to another, a grotesque journey that would span a century and a continent. Their story, which began in a remote village in Mexico, would not end in a quiet cemetery, but in a series of dusty museums and carnival shows, a final and brutal testament to a life of relentless exploitation. The stage was set, and the final act was about to begin, a century-long performance of a woman and her child, a performance that would not end until their bodies were finally laid to rest, over 150 years after their deaths. The macabre journey of Julia Pastrana's remains and those of her son began the moment Theodore Lent had them embalmed. We left Lent, a man who had turned his dead wife and child into a grotesque business, pocketing the profits from a morbidly curious public. But his story and their journey would not end with his death. After his passing, the bodies, a permanent and tragic record of a life of exploitation, became a commodity to be bought and sold, their fate forever tied to the whims of showmen and collectors. You can almost feel the chill of the air as the glass case containing the bodies of a woman and her child is moved from one dark corner to another. The grand theatres and packed houses of Lent's tours were replaced by a series of dusty museums, private collections and travelling carnivals. This is a mainstream historical fact. The bodies of Julia and her son were sold and resold numerous times, passing through the hands of a variety of owners who saw them as nothing more than a valuable asset, a testament to the era's profound lack of empathy and its insatiable appetite for the bizarre. The bodies were first sold to a travelling showman who continued to tour with them, much like Lent had. He would display them in a glass case, a permanent and silent spectacle, a morbid curiosity for a public that was still fascinated by the ugliest woman in the world. The posters for these shows were just as sensational as the ones Lent had used, but now they were even more grotesque. They were no longer selling a live performance, they were selling a permanent exhibit, a testament to the strange and wonderful mysteries of nature. The bodies would eventually end up in a series of museums, their glass case a permanent fixture in a hall of curiosities and medical oddities. You can picture the school children, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with a mix of fascination and horror. For them, Julia was not a person with a story. She was an exhibit, a strange and unusual object to be studied and gawked at. Her life, her struggles, her profound humanity. It was all lost in the cold, clinical glare of a museum light. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that, at one point, the bodies were even stolen by a group of thieves who thought they were mummies of immense value. They were later recovered, a testament to the strange and bizarre journey that Julia's remains would take. It's a detail that, in its absurdity, speaks to the profound lack of respect and dignity that she was afforded even in death. Her body, a symbol of her tragic life, was now an object of crime, a piece of stolen property to be bartered and sold. Historians still argue about the precise timeline of the body's journey. They were bought and sold so many times, passed from one owner to another, that their trail is often difficult to follow. But what is clear is that they were never given a moment of peace. They were always on the move, always on display, a perpetual performance that would not end. The tragedy of her life had become a perpetual exhibition, a cruel and unending show that would continue for over a century. The bodies would eventually find a temporary home in a travelling carnival in Norway, a final, fittingly grotesque stage for a woman who had spent her entire life on display. They were displayed in a glass case, alongside other oddities and curiosities, a silent and haunting testament to a life of exploitation. You can almost feel the cold Scandinavian air, the smell of sawdust and cheap popcorn, as people would walk past her glass case, their eyes filled with a mix of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. The constant travel and the lack of proper care began to take their toll on the bodies. They were not preserved in the way a modern scientist would preserve a specimen. They were embalmed with crude chemicals, and the centuries of neglect began to show. The skin began to darken, the features began to sag, and the bodies became more and more of a grotesque caricature of the people they once were. It was a final, devastating assault on their dignity, a slow and horrifying process of decay that was a fitting metaphor for the way her life had been treated. The story of Julia Pastrana and her son, in this period of their journey, is a story of profound dehumanization. They were no longer people, they were objects, commodities, a source of income for a series of men who saw them as nothing more than a valuable asset. Their journey, which began in a remote village in Mexico, would not end in a quiet cemetery, but in a series of dusty museums and carnival shows, a final and brutal testament to a life of relentless exploitation. The stage was set, and the final act was about to begin, a century-long performance of a woman and her child, a performance that would not end until their bodies were finally laid to rest, over 150 years after their deaths. The bodies of Julia Pastrana and her son, a grotesque and permanent spectacle, continued their journey through the dark underbelly of entertainment and pseudoscience. We left them being passed from owner to owner, their humanity stripped away, their remains a commodity. After their initial tours and stints in museums, their final long-term resting place would be one of the most bizarre and macabre chapters of their story. They ended up in Norway, a final, fittingly bizarre stage for a woman who had spent her entire life on display. You can almost feel the cold Scandinavian air, the heavy scent of old wood and neglect, as the bodies are stored in a dusty warehouse in Oslo. This is a mainstream historical fact. The bodies of Julia and her son eventually came into the possession of the Norwegian state, after a travelling carnival they were a part of went out of business. They were stored in a collection of medical curiosities and oddities at the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Oslo. They were not on public display anymore, but they were not at peace. They were an exhibit, a scientific curiosity, a permanent and silent testament to a life of profound exploitation. For decades, the bodies remained in the university's collection, largely forgotten by the public. But their story, like a ghost, refused to be buried. The bodies, which had been so meticulously preserved by Lent, were now a source of fascination for a new generation of academics and researchers. They were studied, measured, and documented, their unique physical characteristics a source of endless debate. The exploitation was no longer for profit but for academic inquiry, a form of intellectual curiosity that was still, in its own way, dehumanizing. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that at one point the bodies were even used as a kind of a medical teaching aid for students. The students would be shown the remains of Julia and her son, their deformities a lesson in human variation and genetic anomalies. It's a chilling detail that speaks to the final, grotesque assault on their dignity. Even in death, they were not afforded the respect of a person. They were a lesson, a piece of meat to be dissected and studied. Historians still argue about the moral implications of keeping the bodies in the university's collection. Was it a form of respectful preservation for scientific study? Or was it a continuation of the same cruel exploitation that had defined their lives? The truth is likely a muddled, complex mix of both. The academics who studied them were not showmen, but they were still treating Julia and her son as objects, as specimens, as a source of data. The line between scientific inquiry and morbid fascination is a thin one, and in this case, it was often blurred. The years passed, and the bodies began to decay. The crude embalming chemicals of the 19th century were not meant to last forever. The skin began to darken, the features began to sag, and the bodies became more and more of a grotesque caricature of the people they once were. It was a final, devastating assault on their dignity, a slow and horrifying process of decay that was a fitting metaphor for the way her life had been treated. The story of the bodies would eventually come to the attention of a group of activists and scholars who believed that Julia and her son deserved to be laid to rest. They began a campaign to repatriate her remains to Mexico, a country that had for so long forgotten its most famous daughter. It was a long and difficult battle, a legal and diplomatic struggle that would take years to resolve. The Norwegian government, which had been in possession of the bodies for so long, was reluctant to give them up. They saw them as a valuable historical and scientific artifact, a testament to the strange and tragic history of the 19th century. The activists, however, were persistent. They argued that Julia was not an artifact but a person. She was a woman with a story, a woman who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. They argued that keeping her body in a university's collection was a continuation of the same cruel exploitation that had defined her life. They argued that it was time for her to go home, to be laid to rest in the mountains of Mexico she had left so long ago. The campaign to repatriate her remains became a global movement, a story that captured the imagination of people all over the world. It was a story of a woman who had been a victim of exploitation for over 150 years, and it was a story of a group of people who were determined to right a historical wrong. The campaign was a testament to the power of memory and the importance of dignity, even in death. And so, we leave Julia and her son in this state of limbo, their bodies in a dusty university collection, their story a topic of international debate. They are no longer a spectacle for a paying public, but they are still not at peace. They are still an object, a subject of debate, a symbol of a tragic and exploitative past. But a new chapter is about to begin. A chapter that will see a long and difficult journey toward dignity and a final heartbreaking act of repatriation and peace. The long and tragic performance of Julia Pastrana's life was finally, after over a century, coming to a close. The long and macabre journey of Julia Pastrana's remains and those of her son was finally nearing its end. We left them in a dusty university collection in Oslo, an artifact of a bygone era, a subject of academic debate but not at peace. The stage was set for a new kind of performance, not for a paying public, but for a group of dedicated activists and scholars who believed that Julia and her son deserved to be laid to rest with dignity. You can almost feel the slow, steady hum of the bureaucracy, the patient phone calls, the carefully worded letters, the diplomatic manoeuvring. The campaign to repatriate her remains was a long and arduous process, a legal and diplomatic struggle that would take years to resolve. This is a mainstream historical fact. The campaign for the repatriation of Julia Pastrana's remains was initiated in the 1970s and gained significant traction in the early 2000s, driven by a group of Mexican artists, academics, and human rights activists. They argued that keeping her body in a university's collection was a continuation of the same cruel exploitation that had defined her life. They saw it not as a preservation of a scientific artifact, but as a perpetuation of a historical injustice. The struggle was not an easy one. The Norwegian government, which had been in possession of the bodies for so long, was reluctant to give them up. They saw them as a valuable historical and scientific artifact, a testament to the strange and tragic history of the 19th century. They argued that the bodies were a unique and important piece of medical history, a subject for endless study and research. It was a classic clash between science and human dignity, a debate that would rage for years in academic and diplomatic circles. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that one of the main drivers of the campaign was a Mexican artist named Laura Anderson Barbeta. She was the one who, in the early 2000s, brought the case to the attention of the Mexican government and began the long and difficult process of negotiation. She saw Julia not as an artifact, but as a symbol, a woman who had been a victim of exploitation for over 150 years. Her work, both artistic and political, was a testament to the power of one person to change a historical wrong. Historians still argue whether the repatriation of her remains was a simple act of justice or a complex political statement. On one hand, it was a profound and long overdue act of dignity, a way to finally grant Julia and her son the peace they had been denied for so long. On the other hand, it was also a way for the Mexican government to reclaim a piece of its history, to bring home a woman who had been for so long a symbol of European and American exploitation. The truth in this case is likely a muddled, complex mix of both. The campaign gained momentum, and the story of Julia Pastrana, once a forgotten figure of the 19th century, became a topic of international news. People all over the world began to hear her story, a story of a woman who was a victim of exploitation, a story that was still playing out over a century after her death. The campaign became a symbol of the fight against historical injustice and the importance of human dignity, even in death. The long and difficult diplomatic negotiations finally came to a close in 2013. The Norwegian government, after years of pressure, finally agreed to release the remains of Julia Pastrana and her son. It was a momentous occasion, a victory for human dignity, and a testament to the power of a few dedicated people to change the course of history. The bodies, which had been a spectacle for so long, were now finally on their way home. You can picture the scene, the quiet and solemn transfer of the bodies from the university's collection to a simple wooden coffin. There was no pomp and circumstance, no grand speeches, just a quiet, respectful ceremony, a final farewell to a woman and her child who had been a victim of exploitation for over 150 years. The long and tragic performance was finally truly coming to a close. The bodies were then flown back to Mexico, a country that had, for so long, forgotten its most famous daughter. The journey was a quiet and respectful one, a stark contrast to the grueling and dehumanizing tours she had been forced to endure in life. She was no longer a commodity to be shipped across the ocean. She was a person, a daughter of Mexico, finally on her way home. And so, we leave Julia and her son on their final journey. The long and tragic performance is over, and a new chapter is about to begin. A chapter of dignity, of respect, and of peace. The final act of her story is not one of exploitation, but one of repatriation and remembrance. The stage is set for her final burial, a quiet and solemn ceremony that will finally grant her the peace she was denied for so long. The long and arduous journey toward dignity for Julia Pastrana was a legal and diplomatic struggle, a battle of wills between a government and a group of determined activists. We left Julia's remains and those of her son being transferred from a dusty university collection in Oslo to a simple coffin, finally on their way home to Mexico. But the journey was more than just a physical transfer. It was a symbolic one, a journey from object to person, from artifact to human being. You can almost feel the quiet solemnity of the moment. After over 150 years of being an exhibit, a spectacle, a piece of property to be bought and sold, Julia and her son were finally being treated with the dignity they deserved. The coffin, a simple wooden box, was a far cry from the glass case they had spent so much time in. It was a private, respectful conveyance for a woman and her child who had been denied privacy and respect for their entire lives. The journey home was not a part of a tour. It was a repatriation, a return to the soil from which she had come. This is a mainstream historical fact. The repatriation of Julia Pastrana's remains was a major international event, covered by media outlets all over the world. It was a story that captured the imagination of people everywhere. a story of a long overdue act of justice. The Mexican government, which had been so quick to forget its most famous daughter, was now at the forefront of the campaign to bring her home. They saw it as a matter of national pride, a way to right a historical wrong and to reclaim a piece of their cultural heritage. The repatriation, however, was not without its controversies. Some academics and scientists argued that the bodies were a valuable historical and scientific artifact and should have remained in the university's collection. They argued that their removal was a loss for science, a permanent end to the possibility of further study, but the activists, led by the artist Laura Anderson Barbata, argued that the right to dignity and a proper burial trumped any claims of scientific or historical value. They argued that a human being is not an artifact and should not be treated as one. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that the artist Laura Anderson Barbata, in her efforts to bring Julia home, created a series of powerful and moving art installations and performances. One of her most famous pieces was a performance where she wore a replica of Julia's famous mask-like face and dressed in a traditional Mexican dress, singing songs and telling stories about Julia's life. It was a way to give Julia a voice, to reclaim her story from the showmen and scientists who had profited from it for so long. It was a powerful act of artistic and political resistance, a way to remember Julia not as a spectacle, but as a person. Historians still argue about the precise timeline of the repatriation process, the diplomatic negotiations, and the political manoeuvring that went on behind the scenes. The process was a long and difficult one, a legal and diplomatic struggle that would take years to resolve. But what is clear is that the repatriation was a victory for human dignity, and a testament to the power of a few dedicated people to change the course of history. The bodies, which had been a spectacle for so long, were now finally on their way home. The final journey of Julia and her son was a quiet and respectful one, a stark contrast to the grueling and dehumanizing tours she had been forced to endure in life. She was no longer a commodity to be shipped across the ocean. She was a person, a daughter of Mexico, finally on her way home. The plane ride was a final act of respect, a quiet and solemn journey for a woman who had been denied so much in life. Upon their arrival in Mexico, the coffin was met with a quiet and respectful ceremony. There were no cameras, no grand speeches, just a quiet and somber gathering of people who had come to pay their respects. It was a final farewell to a woman and her child who had been a victim of exploitation for over 150 years. The long and tragic performance was finally, truly coming to a close. The journey from the airport to her final resting place was a long and solemn procession. The coffin was carried on a simple horse-drawn carriage, a tribute to her humble origins in the mountains of Mexico. The people of her hometown, Sinaloa de Leyva, lined the streets, their faces filled with a mix of grief and respect. They were not there to see a spectacle, they were there to welcome home one of their own, a woman who had been a victim of a cruel and exploitative world, but who had, in her own way, become a symbol of resilience and human dignity. And so, we leave Julia and her son on their final journey home. The long and tragic performance is over, and a new chapter is about to begin. A chapter of dignity, of respect, and of peace. The final act of her story is not one of exploitation, but one of repatriation and remembrance. The stage is set for her final burial, a quiet and solemn ceremony that will finally grant her the peace she was denied for so long. The long and tragic journey of Julia Pastrana and her son, which began in a remote village in Mexico and spanned a century of exploitation, was finally coming to a close. We left her remains, and those of her son, on a quiet and respectful journey home, a journey that was a stark contrast to the dehumanizing tours she had been forced to endure in life. The final act of her story was not one of spectacle, but of solemn remembrance and profound peace. You can almost feel the gentle hush of the air in the small cemetery in Sinaloa de Leyva, Mexico, as the final ceremony begins. The mountains that had once been her home now stood as silent witnesses to her return. There were no cameras, no grand speeches, no morbidly curious crowds, just a quiet gathering of people who had come to pay their respects. They were not there to see a spectacle. They were there to welcome home one of their own, a woman who had been a victim of a cruel and exploitative world, but who had, in her own way, become a symbol of resilience and human dignity. This is a mainstream historical fact. On February 12th, 2013, Over 150 years after her death, Julia Pastrana was finally laid to rest in a simple wooden coffin in a local cemetery. The burial was a profoundly emotional and symbolic event, a final act of justice for a woman who had been denied dignity for so long. The coffin was carried by local men, their faces sombre and respectful, a final tribute to a woman who had been a victim of a world that had so profoundly misunderstood her. The burial was a way to reclaim her story, to re-establish her humanity, and to grant her the peace she had been denied for so long. The ceremony was a testament to the long and difficult campaign that had brought her home. The artist Laura Anderson Barbata, who had spearheaded the movement, was there, a quiet and solemn presence. She had seen Julia not as an artifact, but as a person, a woman who deserved to be laid to rest with dignity. Her work, both artistic and political, was a testament to the power of one person to change a historical wrong. The burial was not just a final act for Julia, it was a final victory for all those who had fought for her. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the ceremony is that a local priest, in his final blessing, referred to her as the most famous woman in the world, a woman who had been a symbol of both profound tragedy and immense resilience. He spoke of her not as a spectacle, but as a person with a soul, a woman who, in her life and in her death, had taught the world a lesson in compassion and humanity. It was a beautiful and fitting tribute, a final act of respect for a woman who had been so profoundly disrespected in life. Historians still argue about the precise timeline of the campaign, the diplomatic negotiations, and the political manoeuvring that went on behind the scenes. The process was a long and difficult one, a legal and diplomatic struggle that would take years to resolve. But what is clear is that the repatriation was a victory for human dignity and a testament to the power of a few dedicated people to change the course of history. The bodies, which had been a spectacle for so long, were now finally at peace. The grave, a simple plot of land in a quiet cemetery, is a far cry from the glass case and the travelling carnival she had spent so much time in. It is a quiet, respectful place, a final home for a woman who had spent her entire life on the road. It is a place where people can come to remember her not as a spectacle, but as a person, a woman who lived and loved and suffered and who, in the end, found a measure of peace. The story of Julia Pastrana is a story of profound tragedy and relentless exploitation, but it is also a story of immense resilience and, in the end, of hope. It is a story that reminds us of the dangers of dehumanization and the importance of dignity, even in death. It is a story that reminds us that a person is not an artifact, not a commodity, and not a spectacle, but a human being with a story and a soul. The final burial of Julia Pastrana and her son was a closing chapter, a final act of justice for a woman who had been denied it for so long. The performance was over, the curtain had finally fallen, and the woman who had been branded the ugliest woman in the world was finally at peace. Her story, however, will continue to be told, not as a spectacle, but as a testament to the power of human dignity and the long and difficult journey toward a final, peaceful rest. Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we... Oops, that's my intro. So, the story ends, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A quiet, peaceful resting place in the Mexican earth she left so long ago. The lights have dimmed, the velvet curtain has fallen for the last time, and the audience, after 153 years of staring, has finally gone home. Julia Pastrana, once a spectacle for the entire world, is now just a memory, a story told in the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the night. It's a heavy thought, I know, to think of a life so profoundly tragic, a life that was one long, excruciating performance. But in the end, she found a measure of peace, a quiet dignity she was denied for so long. The exploitation is over, the journey is finished, and the woman who was branded the ugliest woman in the world is finally at home. As you drift off to sleep, maybe think of her not as a curiosity, but as a person, a woman who, in her own way, taught the world a lesson in compassion.